Well, can I say first of all, I agree with everything Ben said except one thing. Hedges are lousy. They provide local concealed access, which can be an advantage. So anything short of a hedge can be okay. And I think one reason I agree with most of it is some of the evidence on which it's based comes from earlier studies of mine. What I'm going to show you today is much bigger scale and recent work, which I think is going to complicate it a bit and to attend also to this divergence of opinion. And I'll try and show that in many cases, these very different opinions about which way is the safe way to go in urban design, there is in fact a sort of a path between these two things, in a sense both are right. But I'm going to concentrate on evidence because we still lack really hard evidence on crime and design. Too much of it still goes back to sort of theoretical ideas that are very old from Oscar Newman, and I think we all know now that it's much more complex than that. And I really have been concerned to develop methods which work at the design level, not at the level of the housing estate, not at the level of the sort of urban area, at the level of the design decisions we actually take in everyday life. Now the first thing about this new set of methods is we use space syntax. Space syntax really, the element of a space syntax model is a segment of street between intersections, a very small thing, but with that we can actually construct models of the whole of London within the M25 as on the left there. And we can give powerful predictions, if you like, of potential movement flows. And through this we've actually come up with a very good understanding, I think, of how cities self-organize themselves over period as networks of linked centres at all scales set into a residential background. We can really explain a lot of this now. And the reason this is important in crime research is because it means we can relate the pattern of crime to the patterns of urban life in general. And this is really what we have to do. So we can take a space syntax model, if you like, and superimpose in a very accurate way the actual locations where all crimes occurred. Now, one reason this is important, it allows us to shift the analysis of scientific analysis of crime patterns from hotspots to the actual risk. Now, it's very important that we understand that hotspot analysis is very popular, and lots of crime analysis packages are available on computers, many of them, in my view, quite simplistic and misleading, because what the victims need to know about crime is the actual risk of crime. I can show you here, for example, on the left, we have street robbery over 5 years in a large chunk of London. You just look at this for a bit and you can see that it's all the red lines, it's all the integrating busy lines where this seems to be associated with. But if and you'll see later that's not what it actually means when you look closely at it. But what it means is that if you have a hotspot, you know that crime occurs there, but there may be 10 times as many pedestrians in that location, which means the risk to you is much less. If you're going home late at night from a tube, and you choose between the street where there was 20 muggings last year, which is busy, and one which is quiet and there was 10 muggings, 10 muggings, you choose the one with 20 muggings because the risk to you is actually later, and you're correct in making that judgment. The same is true of residential burglary. People produce hotspot maps, and it makes it appear it's concentrated in places where there's a larger number of targets. Now, if it was random, that would happen anyway. So with this technique, we can actually calculate the risk of crime to potential victims. Now, the police, of course, need to know where the hotspots are because their job is to deploy resources to where crime occurs. But victims need to know the diffusion of risk and, are you more likely or less likely to be burgled in this kind of location or robbed on the street in this kind of location. Now, another advantage of this is that we can study crime patterns at a very much larger scale without losing precision and local accuracy. The study I'm going to show you elements of involves 5 years of crime in a population of over 250,000 with 13,000 residential burglaries and 6,000 street robberies. Now, that's a lot of evidence, all precisely located. And we have the additional advantage that with this method of analysis, we can immediately relate the crime patterns to the social and demographic patterns and factors through the 2001 census, which is still recent enough to be fairly accurate. So, if we look at these patterns, we see that the burglary pattern shows no pattern that you can actually see at all, whereas the street robbery pattern does seem to be related to the kind of what you might call the dominant network. And as I've already said, what we actually find in the locations where there appears to be more street robbery, there are of course 10 times as many pedestrians. And if you calculate the pedestrian movement rates, and you might think in looking at this map that we shouldn't go shopping in the high street. In fact, you're safer there because the risk is actually much lower. Although I'll say one more word about that in a moment. So by seeing a pattern of risk, we can get much more than simply by plotting dots on maps. But what are the places like that street robbery does occur? Well, we've already seen, you know, the dangers of unlit places and what have you. But here on this scale, we can actually show some more interesting effects, I think. This is actually showing the pattern of street robbery in one local area in our London borough during the daytime period. This shows the pattern during the nighttime period. During the nighttime period, it also becomes much more concentrated. It becomes higher at certain times of the night period, but the focus is in different places. And in fact, what we can do is if we plot it throughout the day, these are the crime rates, the street robbery rates for different time periods. This is the early morning, this is the morning period, this is lunchtime. This is the late afternoon period, early evening, and this is the post-midnight period. And we can see that the peak is very strongly at in the peak periods. But when we analyse statistically where these occur, we can see that this is following the left-hand pattern. They're actually occurring in spaces which are quite different to the ordinary ones. They're occurring in more segregated spaces, spaces with less movement, spaces with less connections. And in fact, we can get more precise than this. We can say that the danger is not on the high street most of the time. The danger is in the streets associated with the high street, where some people have to go some of the time, but there isn't much natural movement. Now you can design this out. You can actually create the connections to the high street so that all the ways, if you like, to other destinations are actually going to have movement in them. We can also say that the pattern of during the diurnal pattern is also such that it actually suggests that if you're a pedestrian, what this little lot here says is, so I'm sorry about this. This works on touching the pad. I'm used to it working on the click, so it keeps jumping without me saying it. But the fact that this is a high robbery time, this is actually the post-midnight period, and what it says is, don't go on the high street after midnight, but don't leave it before midnight. It means before the midnight period, you're relatively safe on the high street, but when everyone's gone home, then the danger actually comes in. And this is a lot of data. This is 6,000 street robberies here that we're talking about. But what about residential burglary, which is the other design-related crime that people worry about a lot? And this is where we have a battle between the two theories that Ben talked about. And I tend to call these the open and closed solutions. Basically, one theory seeks to keep places safer by keeping people out. The other by bringing people in, you know, by eyes on the street and that kind of thing. Is one right and the other wrong? Well, I'm going to suggest they're actually both right in some ways. And as Ben said, there are certain circumstances when closing things off is very useful. It's basically when you have poorly used access. What I'm going to show you, in fact, is that the more we understand about the complexities of the crime-space relationship, the more we can see that both these two different points of view, what the Americans call safescape, which is the new urbanism idea, and defensible space, the more traditional idea, that both have got important elements of the truth with them. But now, the trouble is that in discussing between, if you like, closed environments and open environments, there is not a neutral question because it links to the issue of sustainability. To minimize energy consumption, we need denser environments with more mixing of uses to make facilities accessible, easier to move about in under personal power. And this means permeable environments in which you can easily go in any direction without too long a detour. And it's equally clear the way we've been expanding our towns in the past few decades with large systems of culdesacs in relatively closed-off areas makes trips much longer on the whole and more awkward and increases car dependency. I mean, we've known for donkey's years that people in the countryside don't walk. You might think they do, but they get in their 4x4s and go everywhere in those. They don't make trips which link things together. They make different trips for different things compared with town dwellers. Now, advocates of the closed solution say that permeable environments are more susceptible to crime because they allow criminals to move everywhere with ease. This is also true, I think. But it means the basic question that I'm going to address is, can open and permeable environments we need for sustainability be constructed in such a way as to also make them safe? Can we get the best of both worlds? That's the question I'm looking at. But let me first of all look at research in the past, before these current studies, which suggests what I think should be common ground between the two approaches. And I think that Ben's already said some of this. First, any secondary exposure of the dwelling, in the sense of anything apart from having one entrance, if you like, increases risk. Side alleys, back alleys, being adjacent to a footpath, open space, even a nice open space of any kind will increase the risk. Second, other things being equal, front-facing houses on the opposite side of the road make you safer. Not everyone knows that. Third, putting car parks into car parks with accessibility and without surveillance away from dwelling entrances increases the risk of car crime and also burglary if it provides back access to dwellings. Ben has already said this. Fourth, simple linear cul-de-sacs forming part of a through network can be safe places, but complex hierarchies of cul-de-sacs, especially if connected by footpaths, can be the least safe layout of all. You can't simply say cul-de-sacs bad or good, through streets bad or good. It all depends on how you contextualize these things. So I'm saying all this in a qualified way because what our studies show is that burglars look for the weakest link, and it will not always be the same in one area as in another. So you've really got to get local knowledge built in as well as knowledge of, if you like, of the overall statistical patterns. So with this, we think we can actually address some of the key urban design questions that are lying between these two points of view, you know. And the first question is, are some kinds of dwellings safer than others? Is density good or bad? Is movement on your street good or bad? Are cul-de-sacs safe or unsafe? Does it matter how we group dwellings? Is mixed use beneficial or not? Should residential areas be permeable or impermeable? Do social factors make a difference? Now these are two questions on which, but the two sides differ completely. The closed environment say mixed use is bad, high density is bad. The other side says the opposite. So can we find a way between these different questions? Well, let me show you some of the data we've got. Now what Ben said, he was reporting the British Crime Survey that showed that when you equalise for family type and for income and things like that, flats were the safest dwellings. What our evidence shows, which by the way covers a very large London borough, which goes from inner to outer, so from central area type housing right through to sort of suburban stuff, it shows that even without the social differentiation, flats are better. Flats are the safest thing to be in. And in fact, as you go from flats down here, this is the numbers in the sample. So we've got something like, we've got 22,000 standard semis. We've got 100,000 dwellings in this sample. It's big data. We can see the rates for flats are lower than for anything else. And it gets bigger and bigger as we go up towards the large detached houses. Now, you might say, well, that's because the tall blocks of flats are social housing, and then therefore the people aren't reporting the crime. Now, this is a factor that you've got to be careful of. So the way we deal with this is we look at the tax band. We assume there's some kind of relationship with the tax band people in and their kind of income level, roughly speaking. And we see that all the people in the tall blocks and the fairly tall blocks are in tax band B. Okay. So let's watch tax band B as we go through and see what happens. Yes, if we take medium height flats between 5 and 6 stories, well, our A's aren't reporting much crime, but our B's are reporting the highest rate of all. That suggests strongly that people at this kind of level are reporting crime, and in fact, there's good solid evidence now that people are reporting crime when they lose something which is important. They will tend to report it to the police. The differences are in the small percentages rather than very large. And what we actually see is that as you go up the class divide, as you get richer, your rates become lower. When you're up to the G's, then the average rate, by the way, is 0.30 for the sample as a whole. So anything above is high and anything below that is low. You can see that a progressive reduction in risk, and you see the reduction going down as well. There appears to be a blip there, but this is a small number of flats, and it may not be the case. And again, as we work through small terraces, we see another, away from flats, we see another kind of pattern emerging. We begin to see a U shape. We see that the B people, you know, the lower income groups, if you like, are highly victimized, and so are the rich. The people in between are having the best time of all. So if you're in the mid bands of the tax bands, then you're likely to be doing better. Again, this is with very, very large samples of standard size semis. The peaks are in the poor and the rich, and the middle classes are the best off. Again, for the large property semis, again, you know. And again, we can sort of show that for... So what it shows is clearly that two factors are involved in the you know, first of all, houses are more at risk than flats are, yeah? And they become more at risk as they become more detached. But the better off you are, the more you are at risk in a house and safe in a flat. I'm saying this is a Barbican dweller, by the way, where we had our first burglary for 3 years earlier this year. So if the posher you get, and I imagine some of you will get very posh if you're in your present jobs, then move to a flat if you want to be safe. Now these results suggest density may be a factor, and I'm not asking you, I'm just showing you sort of a bit of science to give you a bit of feeling. It's there if you want to read it. It is on the web and is accessible. This led us to sort of ask questions about density, because if we do an analysis of all the output areas in this London borough, and say, well, what factors are associated with different crimes, you know, all social factors, demographic factors, ethnic factors, physical factors, spatial factors. It's not the social factors that come out strongly, it's the type of dwelling is powerful. Certainly there's more crime in underprivileged areas in general. But the other thing that came out was very surprising. It's that the higher the density in the output area, the lower the crime rate. And it was very, very strong, and it wasn't affected by looking at social variables. So we developed a very nice little trick. We took every dwelling, all the 100,000 dwellings, and we put a point in the middle. Then we drew a circle 30 meters around them and counted the number of other dwellings at ground level and upper ground level. They were within that 30 meters. In other words, we're defining density central on every dwelling. And it shows quite clearly that higher ground level densities are beneficial in keeping crime rates down. It also shows that upper residential densities are not beneficial in that kind of way. So we can differentiate, if you like, on the density argument, saying, well, ground level density really does seem... we tested this. We took all the very different areas in this large London borough, from the suburban to the central areas and the housing estates and what have you, and say, well, does this hold in all the areas? And it does hold in all the areas. And then we did it by the type of dwelling as well. Does it hold just for flats, just for houses, and it holds for them as well? So with these tests, we can be very confident, I think, that the argument about density is not simple, and that in certain important senses, ground level density is a benefit. Now, the same question about movement. People say movement's dangerous, having people going past your house because one of them might be a criminal. Some of our data showed that the more important residential streets with more movement were actually a lot safer than the ones in the back of the area. Is there any way we can reconcile this? Well, again, with this new, much more clever analysis based on the segment of the street, we can show something much more subtle. We can show that if you are adjacent to large level movement, large scale movement, if you like, across the city, then movement is a disbenefit. You're on the search path of the criminal, if you like. But in terms of localized movement, it's actually a benefit. It actually switches around according to how your street fits into the more localized pattern. So basically it means if you're on the main streets, then it can be a disbenefit. But if you're on the important, more localized streets, then it switches around and it becomes the better place to be. Now this is beginning to tell us sort of results about that I think have not been seen before. And it's led us to another thing, which I think is very important from a design point of view. We began to see signs that the more isolated, if you like, the more isolated you were in small groups of residences, the more vulnerable you were. Now this goes against the sort of common ideas, but let me show you how we did it. I say we've got 100,000 dwellings, okay? We've got 7,000 segment of streets in this area. 328 of these had exactly one dwelling on them. And when we calculate the burglary rate for that, for those 328 dwellings, it's 12% a year. That's a very, very high rate of burglary, 12% a year, compared with an average of 3.37% per year, yeah? But if we take the 34 segments with more than 90 dwellings on them, yes, we find a total of 3,708 dwellings with 419 burglaries over 5 years. That's a rate of 2.26 per year. Now, so we did this for all of them. We said so what I've got here is that each of these dots, these are all the segments with one dwelling on them. Those are the ones with two, and it gradually goes up until you have 100 plus. And on the vertical axis is the burglary rate, and you can see the more on the more residences you have on the street segment, it goes down and down and down, and the difference between the high and the low is a factor of 5. Now this is something which is completely unknown because we sort of, but we are dealing with 100,000 dwellings here, so it's the biggest sample that's ever been looked at. And you can actually see some of these patterns. The red patches you can see on here are the segments with large numbers of dwellings on the segment. And you can see they tend to be in the more grid-like areas. It doesn't mean to say that these places are safe, but it doesn't mean to say that on average they have lower rates and much lower rates than some of the more broken up kind of space. Now it could be here we're just talking about surveillance. I think there may be another reason. Kate Bowers of the Jill Dunlop Institute recently showed that once you have a burglary in a certain place, and there will be another one and another one after that very close to it. I think there's also a saturation effect that once they've done 3 or 4, they move on somewhere else because the place is becoming sensitized. So I think there may be just a statistical advantage in having lots and lots of dwellings on your segment. Again, the same is true of what we call spatial integration, which is the variable that produces the amount of movement. It turns out that what this means here is these are the segments of space with few dwellings, and what it means is that that as you increase the integration of those segments, increase movement along segments with small amounts of dwellings, then the risk of crime increases. But when you increase the numbers of dwellings on the segment, it goes the other way. So you've got two effects, and the critical point is about 25 dwellings on the segment. Well below that, and more people moving along, if you like, increases risk. Less, with more than that, then more people passing along. In other words, the stronger the residential factor, the more you can absorb strangers. This is the crucial measure. Now this applies to mixed use as well. Again, I'll try and explain what this is. The squares here, oh dear me, why does it do this? The squares here, well, let me do it with this. This matters, right? These squares are all. These are the dwellings dwellings per segment going along with no mixed use on them, right? These are the ones with between 1 and 4 non-residential uses, and these are the ones with more than 4 residential uses on the dots. What you can see is that when you have very few dwellings on the segment, the penalty is very great. If you have a few people living on a mixed-use segment, then their increase of vulnerability is very great. But as you increase the number of dwellings per segment, that penalty disappears. In other words, the stronger the residential density, the stronger the residential culture, the more the penalty is neutralized. This, I think, is an absolutely crucial thing, the point I'm going to make. The third one is about the cul-de-sac versus grid debate. We've already seen that certain grid-like elements are safer. But again, the number of dwellings per segment is the crucial thing. If we look at the rate of burglary for 1 and 2 connected segments, it's on average lower than the average for all. But if we look at those with no more than 10 dwellings, it's nearly twice the average rate. While 6 connected, by the way, means you're connected to 3 segments at the end of each segment, so it means grid-like layouts. Grid-like segments with more than 100 dwellings have a rate of 0.006. In other words, Again, it's all to do with, if you like, the residential culture and the residential density. So the defensible space were right in stressing, if you like, residential culture, but you can extend this also to the more grid-like layouts. So the key to making cul-de-sacs safer is actually increasing the number of people in them and making them linear. This also interacts with social class, in that it turns out that basically the richer you are, the higher your penalty for living in a small cul-de-sac, and the poorer you are, the less the penalty. Whereas if you're living on a grid-like layout, then the more beneficial it is if you're well off. In other words, people, they have burglar alarms and what have you, but they get the benefit of living on a more grid-like layout. So there's an interaction, if you like, with social class and all these things. So let me summarize this then. The safety of dwellings is really affected by two interacting factors. One is the number of sides in which the dwelling is exposed to public realm, yes? So flats have least risks and detached houses have most. But that interacts with the social class of inhabitants, but in a simple way, and we can easily get the hang of it. Higher local ground level densities reduce risk, higher off the ground densities not so. It may be living in a flat off the ground you're safer, but you're not benefiting your ground level neighbours. There's a kind of a trade-off between these two things. And on the other hand, other factors can make ground level living more secure. The larger number of dwellings on the street segment, the lower the risk of crime. And this applies to cul-de-sacs and through streets. Again, it goes against what we think. Smallness is not beautiful. Linear is beautiful. Big is beautiful. Even in cul-de-sacs, you'll find that is safer. Again, this affects the amount of movement we have. The more movement there's to be, the greater the density of residents that you need to counterbalance that. The penalty on mixed-use crime, mixed-use segments is neutralised by increased residential population. And again, we find we need to be sensitive to the interaction of social and spatial factors. One more thing, no more slogans. It's more complicated than we thought. We can't say this is bad and this is good. But we can design things, and I think maybe it's common sense. We can design open but safe environments. We must create permeability in all directions, but as Ben said, all space must be structured for its appropriate scale of movement. Use space syntax is the only thing that can predict this. And you must avoid unused permeability, as this is always hazardous. People are breaking blocks up too much and creating, if you like, romantic noddy land layouts. You must have a block sizing and numbers on the blocks proportionate, if you like, to the scaling of movement in that area. Ensure all parts of the street space have dwelling entrances on them, and the more the better. Entrances are more powerful than windows in the surveillance mechanism, I believe. Join buildings together so the only access to the dwelling is from the street, and avoid any other kind of secondary exposure, especially on streets with more movement, because that can be highly vulnerable. Have as many dwellings as possible on the street in segment, both for streets and cul-de-sacs, and increase this with more movement, and make cul-de-sacs linear with good numbers of dwelling. For the well-off especially, as say small cul-de-sacs are hazardous. And I think the most important thing of all is that I do believe on the result of this data that the mixed-use patterns that we need for sustainability really do depend on residential density and residential numbers, that they're riskier with low numbers of people and they become much more safe with high numbers of people. Just one word of warning. We are now doing a large-scale study of Manchester. It may be that some of the things I say are characteristic of the large London area and they're different up north. I think it's unlikely because our area is so diverse, but I want to give you the warning. And this is where some of the things I've been talking about can be found. Thank you.